The galaxy belonged to the Valaran Dominion, and everyone in it knew this simple truth. For 12,000 years, the Dominion had spread across 4,000 star systems like a slow and terrible fire. They had crushed every civilization that stood in their way. They had burned worlds, enslaved entire species, and wiped out 14 races so completely that not even their names survived. The Dominion did not ask for surrender. It simply arrived, and whatever was there before stopped existing. At the center of it all sat Emperor Zaelthar on his throne of living crystal, deep within the palace of Orithane, the throne world. He was old now, older than any Valaran had a right to be, kept alive by machines and medicines that only the royal bloodline could access. His scales had faded from their once proud dark blue to a dull gray, and his eyes, once sharp enough to read fear in a soldier from across a room, had grown cloudy. But his mind was still ablade. He feared nothing, or so he told himself every morning when he looked out at the stars and reminded himself that they all belonged to him. On the far edge of Dominion space, Admiral Sathari stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the last free corner of the galaxy fall into line. The Korath Nebula, a thick cloud of dust and gas, where rogue traders and runaway slaves had hidden for centuries, was finally being cleaned out. Her fleet of 800 warships moved through the nebula like wolves through snow, and one by one the little stations and hidden colonies sent their surrender signals. It was not even a real battle. It was just the end of a long and boring chase. Sathari was tall, even for a Valaran. Her armor was black and decorated with silver marks that told the story of 30 years of war. She had conquered 11 species personally. She had never lost a battle, and she was bored. The galaxy was a quiet pond, and the Dominion was the only fish in it. She did not know that this was about to change. Far away, on the throne world, a young intelligence officer named Fenrath walked through the long white halls of the Imperial War Council building with a data tablet clutched tightly in his hands. He was nervous. He was always nervous. He was small for a Valaran, with pale green scales and a voice that never quite carried the authority he wanted it to. He had been assigned to the Deep Space Listening Post Division, which was the place they sent officers who were too smart to fire, but too unimportant to promote. His job was to monitor signals from the empty parts of the galaxy, the places where nothing lived and nothing happened. Except something had happened. 3 weeks ago, Listening Post 7734, stationed on the edge of a region of space called the Dead Corridor, had picked up a signal. It was faint, structured, and encrypted in a way that no known species used. Fenrath had checked it twice, then 3 times, then 10 times. He had run it through every decoder the Dominion possessed. He could not break it. He could not even identify what kind of technology had produced it. But it was real. Something was out there, in a part of space that every survey had declared completely and absolutely empty. He presented his findings to the War Council. They sat in their high chairs, 12 old Valarian generals with heavy medals and heavier opinions. And they listened to him for exactly 4 minutes before the senior counselor raised a hand and stopped him. "The Dead Corridor has been surveyed 6 times, the counselor said. "There is nothing there. Your equipment is faulty. Replace it and stop wasting our time." Fenrath opened his mouth to argue, but the look in the counselor's eyes told him that arguing would be the last thing he ever did in this building. He closed his mouth, bowed his head, and left. By the end of the day, he had been reassigned to a supply depot on a moon so far from the throne world that it took 2 weeks to get a mail delivery. But the signal did not care about Valaran politics. It continued, steady and patient, pulsing out from the darkness like a heartbeat. And Emperor Zaelthar, who had spies in every room and ears in every wall, heard about Fenrath's report before the young officer had even left the building. The Emperor sat alone in his private chamber that night, surrounded by screens that showed him every corner of his empire. And he thought about the dead corridor. He thought about the signal, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something cold move through his chest. He summoned the Pale Archive. The Pale Archive was the most secret organization in the Dominion. They had no uniforms, no offices, no public records. They existed in the spaces between official history, and their job was to keep the things that the Empire did not want to remember. Every conquered species, every buried scandal, every weapon too terrible to use, it all lived in the archive. The archivist who answered the Emperor's call was a thin, ancient Valerine with white scales and eyes that had seen too many terrible things. "I have a question," the Emperor said, "and I want the truth, not the version of truth that makes the Empire feel safe." The archivist waited. "What do you know?" the Emperor asked slowly. "About species that hide." The archivist was silent for a long time. Then she reached into her robe and produced a small crystal, no bigger than a finger. She placed it on the Emperor's desk. It was old, impossibly old. It predated the Dominion itself. It had been left behind by the precursors, the ancient civilization that had once ruled the galaxy, and then vanished without explanation. The Emperor activated the crystal. A single message appeared, written in the precursor language that only the archive could still read. The archivist translated it in a voice that was barely a whisper. "Do not look toward Saul. Do not call out. If they come, it is already too late." The Emperor stared at the words. "What is Saul?" "A star," the archivist said. "A small yellow star on the far edge of the galaxy, in the dead corridor." The cold thing in the Emperor's chest grew teeth. That same night, 12,000 light-years away, a Dominion patrol fleet of 200 warships was making a routine sweep along the outer border. They were experienced crews, well-armed, following a path they had flown 100 times before. At exactly the 3rd hour of the night cycle, every ship in the fleet stopped sending signals. There was no distress call. No weapons fire appeared on any sensor. No explosion lit up the darkness. 200 warships and 60,000 Valerian soldiers simply stopped existing, as quietly and completely as a candle flame pinched between two fingers. When the morning shift at Border Command noticed the silence, they sent a message to the patrol fleet. Then another. Then another. No one answered. The silence from the dead corridor grew deeper, and somewhere in that silence, something very old and very patient turned its attention toward the Valerian Dominion, and began, for the first time, to move. Admiral Sci-Fi received the orders while she was still cleaning up the last pockets of resistance in the Korath Nebula. The message came directly from the Emperor himself, which had never happened before in her entire career. It was short. 200 ships missing. No explanation. Proceed to last known coordinates with full battle strength. Trust no one. Report only to the throne. She assembled a grand armada of 2,000 warships, the largest force she had ever commanded, and set course for the outer border. The journey took 3 days through hyperspace, and during those 3 days, Sci-Fi did something she had never done before. She worried. 200 ships did not simply vanish. Ships exploded, or they surrendered, or they limped home with holes in their sides and stories to tell. In 30 years of war, she had never once encountered a force that could destroy a full patrol fleet without leaving so much as a scratch on the empty space where they had been. The armada arrived at the last known coordinates of the patrol fleet and found nothing. Absolutely nothing. The space was empty, dark, and cold. There was no wreckage floating in the void, no frozen bodies tumbling through the silence, no energy residue from weapons fire, no black box signals, no distress beacons, just stars and emptiness, exactly as it should be, as if 200 warships and 60,000 souls had never existed at all. Sci-Fi ordered a full scan. Every ship in the armada turned its sensors outward and searched. They scanned for heat, for radiation, for gravitational disturbances, for chemical traces, for anything at all that would tell them what had happened here. Hours passed. The bridge crew grew restless. Officers exchanged glances that carried the weight of unspoken fear. Then a young sensor officer named Drea noticed something that made her stop breathing. She had been staring at the star field behind a particular set of coordinates, running a routine light analysis, when she realized that the stars were wrong. Not missing, not different, but slightly out of place. The light coming from behind that patch of space was bending, just barely, as if something with enormous mass was sitting there, invisible, pulling at the fabric of space itself, like a stone resting on a sheet of silk. "Admiral," Drea said, and her voice cracked on the word. "There is something at coordinate 77. I cannot see it, but it is there." Sci-Fi walked to the sensor station and looked at the readings herself. She saw what Drea saw, a distortion, a wrongness, something that should not be there, but undeniably was. She opened her mouth to give an order. She never got the chance. The distortion vanished, and in its place, a ship appeared. The word ship was not enough. It was like calling an ocean a puddle. The vessel was 5 kilometers long from bow to stern, angular and sharp-edged, built from something blacker than the space around it. It had no visible engines, no glowing shields, no energy signature that any sensor could identify. It sat in the void like a piece of darkness that had decided to take a shape, and it was utterly and completely silent. 2,000 Valaran warships stared at it, and for a long moment, nobody on any bridge said a single word. Then the optical scanners focused on the hull, and Sci-Fi saw writing, white letters, crisp and clear against the black surface, in a language she had never seen. Her ship's translation systems worked on it for 3 seconds, then returned a result. UNSS Carthage, Earth Federation Navy. Earth. The word meant nothing to her. It was not in any Dominion database. No conquered species had ever mentioned it. No explorer had ever logged it. It was a ghost, a name from nowhere, attached to a ship that should not exist. The Carthage hailed them. The communication appeared on every screen on every ship in the Armada simultaneously, which should have been impossible. A calm female voice spoke, in perfect Valaran, without accent, without hesitation, as if the speaker had been born on the throne world itself. "This is Captain Miriam Okafor Singh, of the Earth Federation Navy vessel Carthage. We would like to speak with whoever is in charge. We will wait." The bridge was silent. Sci-Fi felt every eye on her. She looked at the impossible black ship on her screen, and she thought about the missing patrol fleet. She thought about the signal from the dead corridor. She thought about all the species she had crushed in her career, and she wondered, for one brief and terrible moment, if this was what it felt like, to be on the other side. Then training took over, and fear turned to fury, because Sci-Fi was Valaran, and the Valaran did not wait. They did not ask questions. They did not negotiate with unknowns. They struck first, and sorted through the ashes later. "All ships," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were not. "Fire." 2,000 warships opened up with everything they had. Plasma lances, kinetic railguns, fusion missiles, gravity torpedoes. The combined firepower of the Dominion's finest poured across the void in a storm of light and metal and rage. It was enough destructive power to crack a moon in half. It was the kind of violence that ended civilizations. It reached the Carthage and stopped, not reflected. It simply stopped existing. Energy beams dissolved into nothing 100 meters from the hull. Missiles winked out like dying sparks. Kinetic rounds, traveling at a fraction of the speed of light, slowed and then hung motionless in space, before fading away like smoke. The Carthage sat in the center of the firestorm, as calm and untouched as a stone at the bottom of a river. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sci-Fi had ever heard. Then the Carthage spoke again, the same calm voice, the same perfect Velarin, but this time there was something underneath it, something that was not anger and not threat, but was far worse than both. It was patience. The patience of something so far beyond you that your rage was not even an insult. It was just noise. That was your one. And with those 3 words, 2,000 warships full of the galaxy's most feared warriors understood, all at once and all together, that they were not predators. They were not even prey. They were simply irrelevant. Every light on the Carthage went dark. The great black ship became truly invisible, a hole in the starfield, a shape made of nothing. And then a sound began. Not through speakers, not through communication channels, but through the hulls of the ships themselves. A low hum, deep and vast, felt in the bones and in the teeth and in the spaces between thoughts. It was the sound of something waking up, something that had been quiet for a very long time and was now deciding whether the things in front of it were worth the effort of acknowledgement. On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Sci-Fi gripped the arms of her command chair until her claws left marks in the metal. Around her, officers stared at their useless screens with wide eyes and open mouths. The hum grew louder, and somewhere, 300 light-years away, on a small blue world orbiting a small yellow star that the Dominion had never bothered to look at, a species that had spent 3 centuries watching the galaxy in perfect silence, finally stepped out of the shadows. Not because they were ready. They had been ready for a long time, but because they had decided, after watching the Dominion burn and enslave and destroy for long enough, that it was time for someone to say no. The hum reached its peak and then cut off, leaving behind a silence so complete that it pressed against the eardrums like deep water. In that silence, 2,000 Velaran warships waited for what would come next, and every soldier aboard understood the same terrible truth. They were not alone in the galaxy. They had never been alone, and the thing that had been watching them all this time had just opened its eyes. The Carthage did not attack. That was the part that broke Admiral Sci-Fi's understanding of how the universe worked. Any sane enemy, having demonstrated such overwhelming superiority, would have pressed the advantage. They would have opened fire, demanded surrender, or simply wiped the armada from existence while they had the chance. That was how war worked. That was how power worked. You had it, and you used it. The Carthage did none of these things. Instead, it did something impossible. One moment, the great black ship was sitting in front of the armada, 5 kilometers of silent darkness hanging in the void. The next moment, it was gone. Not gone as in it flew away, not gone as in it entered hyperspace, which left a visible tear in space that any sensor could track. It was simply not there anymore, as if it had been erased from one place and written into another. It took 12 seconds for the news to reach the armada. 12 seconds for the panicked signals to travel from the throne world of Orathane, across thousands of light years, to Admiral Sci-Fi's flagship. 12 seconds for her to understand that the Carthage had not retreated. It had moved directly into orbit above the most heavily defended world in the entire Dominion. Orathane was not just the capital. It was a fortress. 10,000 warships formed the home fleet that patrolled its space at all times. 3 orbital defense platforms, each the size of a small moon, bristled with weapons powerful enough to crack planets. Minefields surrounded the system in layers so thick that even Dominion ships needed special codes to pass through safely. It was the most protected place in the galaxy, and the Carthage had appeared there as casually as a bird landing on a windowsill. Panic consumed the throne world. The home fleet scrambled from their stations in a chaos of engine burns and shouted orders. Planetary shields activated for the first time in 800 years. Massive energy barriers wrapping around Orithane like a glowing shell. Ground batteries powered up. Fighter squadrons launched. Emperor Zaelthar was seized by his personal guard and dragged to the deepest bunker beneath the palace. A place carved into the planet's core, designed to survive anything up to and including the death of the star itself. The Carthage orbited slowly above it all, as calm and steady as a moon. It made no aggressive moves. It deployed no weapons. It simply circled the throne world with the quiet confidence of something that knew with absolute certainty that nothing below could touch it. 6 hours passed. 6 hours of the most powerful empire in the galaxy holding its breath. 10,000 warships pointing their weapons at a single target and not daring to fire. Because every officer in the home fleet had already received the report from Cathari's armada. They knew what happened when you shot at the Carthage. They knew about the 3 words. That was your one. Then the Carthage opened a channel, and every screen on the throne world lit up. Every military display, every civilian broadcast unit, every personal communication device on the planet showed the same image at the same time. A human woman sat in a command chair, on a bridge that was clean and simple, and lit with a warm, soft light that seemed completely wrong for a warship. She was middle-aged, with dark skin and dark hair pulled back tight, and she wore a uniform so plain and undecorated that any Valeran officer would have mistaken her for a low-ranking clerk. But her eyes were steady in a way that had nothing to do with rank or medals. They were the eyes of someone who had already decided exactly what she was going to do, and was simply waiting for the rest of the universe to catch up. "My name is Captain Miriam Okafor Singh," she said in Valeran so perfect it sent a chill through every listener. "I am here on behalf of the Earth Federation. I will be brief." She looked directly into the camera, and 10 billion Valeran felt as though she was looking directly at them. "We know what you have done. We have watched you for a very long time. We watched you burn the Korath homeworld. We watched you enslave the people of Tessith. We watched you poison the oceans of Marlan and hunt the last of the Severi through the forests of their own planet until there were none left. 14 species erased. 40 billion lives ended. We have the records. We have the names. Every single one." She paused, and the silence was heavier than gravity. "We are not here to conquer you. We have no interest in your throne, your territory, or your power. We are here to deliver a choice. You have 1 galactic standard year to begin meaningful reform. Release the slave worlds. Dismantle the instruments of oppression. Allow the species you have subjugated to govern themselves. Begin the process of accountability for what has been done." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "If you do not, we will unmake your capacity for war. Not destroy, unmake. Every warship will go dark. Every weapon will cease to function. Every piece of military technology in the Dominion will stop working permanently. You will be returned to a state where you can no longer threaten anyone. This is not a negotiation. This is a notification." Emperor Zaelthar watched from his bunker, his claws digging into the arms of his chair so hard that they drew blood from his own palms. His advisors stood around him in frozen silence. On the screen, the human woman tilted her head slightly, as if she could see him through the walls and stone and metal between them. "I understand that words are easy to dismiss," she said, "so I will offer a demonstration. Emperor, I would ask you to direct your attention to orbit." Every camera on the throne world turned upward. In orbit, hanging among the warships and defense platforms, was the largest and most feared military installation in the Dominion, the Fist of Zael. It was a battle station the size of a mountain, crewed by 80,000 soldiers, armed with weapons that could sterilize a continent from orbit. It was the symbol of the Emperor's absolute power, and it had kept the throne world safe for 500 years. Every light on the Fist of Zael went out. It happened all at once, as if someone had simply reached inside the station and turned off existence. Engines, weapons, shields, sensors, communications, everything went dark simultaneously. 80,000 soldiers suddenly found themselves floating in a dead metal shell, with nothing working except the lights in the hallways and the air flowing through the vents. Life support remained. Everything else was gone. The Fist of Zael, the mightiest weapon in the Dominion's arsenal, had become a very large, very expensive metal box. On every screen, Captain Okafor Singh waited exactly 10 minutes. Then she nodded to someone off camera, and the Fist of Zael came back to life. Systems rebooted, lights returned, 80,000 soldiers gasped and grabbed onto anything solid as gravity and power flooded back into the station. "A courtesy," the captain said. "You have 1 year." The Carthage continued its slow orbit for exactly 1 more hour, then vanished again, disappearing from Orathane's sky as silently as it had arrived. In the bunker, Emperor Xylthar sat in silence for a very long time. His advisors waited. They had seen the fear in his eyes during the broadcast, and they knew better than to speak before he did. Finally, the Emperor stood. His hands had stopped shaking. His eyes had gone hard again, not with courage, but with the desperate fury of a cornered animal that would rather burn the world down and admit it was no longer the most dangerous thing in it. "Assemble everything," he said. "Every fleet, every reserve, every vassal army, and burn it." His advisors bowed and left to carry out his orders, and none of them dared to say what they were all thinking, which was that you cannot burn something you cannot find, and you cannot fight something you cannot hurt, and you especially cannot defeat something that turns off your greatest weapon for 10 minutes just to make a point, and then politely turns it back on again. But the Emperor had given an order, and orders were followed. That was how the Dominion worked. It was the only way the Dominion knew how to work. And so the greatest military machine in the history of the galaxy began to turn its full and terrible attention toward a small yellow star it had never heard of, on the edge of a stretch of empty space it had always ignored, where something had been waiting in the dark for a very, very long time. Meanwhile, on a forgotten supply depot, on a forgotten moon, Fenrath received a new set of orders. Someone important had remembered his report about the signal from the dead corridor, and suddenly the young officer nobody had listened to was the most important intelligence analyst in the Dominion. His new mission was simple: find the humans. Find their home. He started with the dead corridor, pulling every scan, every survey, every scrap of data ever collected from that region. And what he found made him sit down very slowly and put his head in his hands. The dead corridor was not empty. It had never been empty. The scans had been fooled. The surveys had been manipulated. And behind the curtain of false readings and phantom signals, the corridor was full of ships, full of stations, full of a civilization that had been living in silence right next door to the most powerful empire in the galaxy, and the empire had never even noticed. There were thousands of them, millions, and they were all watching. The largest fleet in the history of the Valeran Dominion assembled in 3 weeks. 50,000 warships drawn from every corner of the empire, pulled from border patrols and garrison duties and orbital defense stations, leaving 100 worlds less protected so that the full might of the Dominion could be aimed at a single target. Admiral Sethari was given command, because despite her failure at the border, she was the only officer who had faced the humans and returned. The Emperor wanted someone who understood the enemy, even if that understanding was built entirely on humiliation. Fenrath was assigned to the flagship as the fleet's intelligence advisor. He sat in a small office next to the bridge, surrounded by screens filled with data about the dead corridor, and he felt sick to his stomach. He had spent every waking hour since his reassignment studying what he had found, and the more he learned, the worse it got. The humans had not just hidden in the dead corridor. They had reshaped it. The false readings that had fooled Dominion surveys for centuries were not the product of simple jamming technology. They were the result of the humans physically altering the properties of space itself, bending light and gravity and sensor waves around their civilization, like water flowing around a stone. The Dominion had looked directly at them and seen nothing, because the humans had made nothing the only thing there was to see. He tried to explain this to Sci-Fi before the fleet departed. She listened, standing at the viewport of her quarters with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. And when he finished, she said only one thing. "We have 50,000 ships. They showed us one." Fenrath wanted to tell her that the one ship they had seen had shrugged off the firepower of 2,000 warships without even noticing. He wanted to tell her that behind the false readings, his best estimates suggested a fleet of human vessels that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He wanted to tell her that they were flying into a trap that had been set 300 years ago. But he saw the look in her eyes, and he understood. She knew all of this. She was going anyway, because the Emperor had commanded it, and because some part of her, the warrior part, that had won 30 years of battles, needed to believe that there was still a fight to be had. The Armada entered the dead corridor on the 4th day. At first, everything seemed normal. Stars hung in the darkness where stars were supposed to be. Space was empty in the way space was supposed to be empty. Sensors showed nothing unusual. The fleet advanced in a tight formation, weapons hot, shields up, every crew on high alert. On the 2nd day inside the corridor, things began to go wrong. Navigation officers on different ships began to disagree about their position. Ship A said the fleet was at one coordinate. Ship B, flying right beside it, said they were somewhere else entirely. The differences were tiny at first, just a few thousand kilometers, but they grew. By the end of the 2nd day, no two ships in the fleet could agree on where they were. Then the timestamps started drifting. The clocks on the flagship said it was the 6th hour of the day cycle. The clocks on the ship next to it said it was the 9th hour. A destroyer at the back of the formation reported that it was somehow 4 hours behind the rest of the fleet, even though it had been keeping perfect pace since departure. Fenrath understood what was happening, and the understanding made him want to scream. The humans had not built defenses in the dead corridor. They had turned the corridor itself into a defense. Space inside it was not flat and straight like normal space. It was folded, bent, layered on top of itself like the pages of a book. The fleet was not flying through empty space. It was flying through a maze built into the fabric of reality itself, and the walls of the maze were made of mathematics and physics and geometry that the Dominion did not have words for. Ships began to vanish. Not in explosions, not in battles. They simply stopped being part of the fleet. A cruiser at the edge of the formation would be there one moment and gone the next, its signal cutting off mid-sentence. Hours later, confused and frightened signals would arrive from across the galaxy, from ships that had somehow been deposited thousands of light years away, alone and lost and completely unharmed. The maze was not killing them. It was scattering them, plucking ships from the formation one by one and dropping them somewhere else, like a child picking up toys and putting them in different rooms. In 3 days, the fleet lost 15,000 ships this way. Not a single weapon had been fired. Not a single life had been lost. But the greatest military force in the galaxy was bleeding away into nothing, and there was no enemy to fight, no wall to break through, no target to shoot at. There was just the empty, folded impossible space of the dead corridor, swallowing them piece by piece. While the Armada struggled in the maze, something else was happening across the Dominion. Something quiet and precise and far more devastating than any battle. On the slave world of Tessith, where 12 million beings wore suppression collars that delivered pain at the touch of a button, every collar deactivated at the same moment. 12 million beings touched their necks and felt nothing. And then they looked at each other. And then they looked at their masters. And the masters suddenly realized that they were very badly outnumbered. On the mining planet of Korath, where workers had been dying in the deep shafts for generations, the automated overseers that guarded the camps shut down. Their weapons powered off. Their tracking systems went blind. The workers walked out of the mines and into the daylight, many of them seeing a sky for the first time in years. On military bases across the Dominion, weapons stockpiles vanished overnight. Not destroyed, not stolen in any way that security systems could detect. They were simply replaced. Where there had been crates of plasma rifles and artillery shells, there were now crates of food, clean water, medical supplies, and small devices that, when activated, displayed translated texts on subjects like self-governance, basic rights, and how to organize a free election. The humans were not fighting a war. They were performing surgery on an empire, cutting away the instruments of cruelty with a precision that made the Dominion's best military minds look like children playing with sticks. And they were doing it all without firing a single shot, without harming a single life, without giving the Dominion the one thing it desperately needed to justify its response, an act of violence to point at and call an invasion. Back in the dead corridor, Admiral Seythari's fleet had been reduced to less than half its original strength. The ships that remained were exhausted, confused, and frightened in a way that no Valarin fleet had ever been frightened before. They were warriors trained to face enemies who shot back, not an enemy that simply rearranged the universe around them until they were lost. Then, for the first time, the humans showed themselves. They appeared ahead of the fleet, blocking the path forward. Dozens of ships, each one as large and dark and silent as the Carthage, arranged in a wall that stretched across the entire navigable corridor. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply existed, in the way that mountains exist. And the message was clear. You go no further. One of Seythari's captains, a young officer whose fear had turned into something desperate and reckless, broke formation and fired a full missile spread at the nearest human ship. The missiles closed the distance in seconds. The captain's ship stopped. It did not explode. It did not go dark. It simply stopped. Every molecule frozen in place, locked in a single instant of time. The crew was alive inside, aware and conscious, their thoughts still moving even though their bodies and their ship existed in a single frozen heartbeat. A message played inside the ship, heard not through speakers, but directly in the minds of every crew member. You are safe. You will be released when this is over. Seythari watched the frozen ship hanging in the void, perfectly still, perfectly preserved, like an insect trapped in glass. She looked at her remaining fleet. She looked at the wall of human ships ahead. She thought about the patrol fleet that had vanished without a trace. And she understood at last that the humans had not destroyed those ships either. They had done the same thing, removed them, set them aside, kept them safe and frozen and alive, waiting for a day when the fighting was over and they could be given back. The humans could have killed every Valarin soldier in the galaxy. That was the most terrifying thing of all. Admiral Seythari, the greatest military commander the Dominion had ever produced, the conqueror of 11 species, the officer who had never lost a battle in 30 years of war, sat down in her command chair and gave the order to stand down. But even as her weapons went silent and her fleet began to drift, a message arrived from the throne world, encrypted, highest priority, from the Emperor himself. Fenrath intercepted it, decoded it, and read it. Then he read it again, because the first time, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Protocol HFY. The Emperor, unable to defeat the humans, unable to find their home, unable to do anything except watch his empire being quietly taken apart around him, had made his final decision. If he could not rule the galaxy, then the galaxy would burn. Protocol HFY was the systematic destruction of every slave world, every vassal planet, every species under Dominion control. Kill ships were already being dispatched. Billions of lives, the very people the humans were trying to free, were about to be murdered by the empire that had enslaved them, for no reason other than spite. Fenrath looked at the message, and then he looked at the wall of silent human ships ahead, and he wondered if the humans already knew. He suspected they did. He suspected they had known about Protocol HFY before the Emperor had even thought of it. The kill ships launched from 18 different military bases across the Dominion, each one heading toward a different world, full of people who had committed no crime except being conquered. They were fast ships, designed for a single ugly purpose, carrying weapons that could turn the surface of a planet into glass in under an hour. Their crews had been given their orders and told nothing else, because Protocol HFY did not require understanding. It required obedience. On the bridge of the Carthage, Captain Miriam Okafor Singh watched the kill ships launch on a display that showed the entire Dominion in real time. Every ship, every signal, every movement across 4,000 star systems appeared on her screen as tiny points of light, and she tracked the kill ships the way a doctor might track a spreading infection. She had known this moment would come. The war planners back on Earth had predicted it with 97% certainty. When you cornered a tyrant, when you took away his power piece by piece and left him with nothing but his pride and his cruelty, he would lash out at the weakest targets he could find. It was as predictable as gravity. That was why Project Aegis existed. 30 years ago, long before the Carthage had ever decloaked, long before anyone in the Dominion had heard the word human, Earth had begun planting operatives across the galaxy. They were remarkable people, trained for decades in alien languages, alien customs, alien biology. Some had undergone surgical modification to pass as members of other species. Others had simply found ways to exist in the spaces the Dominion did not watch. The servant quarters, the maintenance tunnels, the forgotten corners of vast and careless bureaucracies. They had lived among the Valaran for years, sometimes decades, building lives, making friends, learning the names of the people they had been sent to protect. And during all those years of silent work, they had been planting devices, small, undetectable machines, no bigger than a grain of sand, buried in the soil and bedrock of every populated world in the Dominion. Thousands of them on each planet, networked together, waiting for a signal that everyone hoped would never need to be sent. Captain Okafor Singh sent the signal. Across the Dominion, on 46 worlds, where billions of enslaved beings lived and worked and suffered, Project Aegis activated. The devices buried beneath the surface of each planet connected to each other and formed a network. And that network did something that no Valaran scientist would have believed possible. It folded space around the entire planet. One moment, the planet was there, orbiting its star, visible on every sensor and every telescope in the system. The next moment, it was gone, not destroyed, not hidden behind a cloak or a shield. It had been moved, shifted sideways into a layer of space that existed parallel to normal reality, but separate from it, like a room that could only be entered through a door that no one else had the key to. The planet was still there, its people were still alive, its sun still shone on its surface. But from the perspective of anyone in normal space, it had simply ceased to exist. The kill ships arrived at their targets and found nothing. Empty orbits, bare coordinates, stars shining on empty space where entire worlds had been just minutes before. The crews stared at their sensors in confused silence, ran their scans again, and got the same result. Every single target on the ashfall list had vanished, taken out of the Emperor's reach with the quiet efficiency of a parent removing sharp objects from the hands of a dangerous child. In his bunker beneath the palace, Emperor Xylthar received the reports one by one. Target 1, gone. Target 2, gone. Target 7, gone. Target 23, gone. All of them, every world he had ordered destroyed, removed from his grasp, as easily as coins lifted from a table. He screamed. He threw things. He broke the screen that showed him the reports and then demanded another screen and broke that one too. His guards stood against the walls and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The most powerful being in the galaxy had just discovered that his power meant nothing, that every weapon he had, every ship, every army, every threat he could make had been rendered completely and totally meaningless by an enemy that would not even do him the courtesy of fighting back. The Carthage appeared above Orithane for the last time. It slid into orbit like a shadow falling across a wall, and every screen on the planet lit up again with the face of Captain Okafor Singh. But this time, she did not speak to the Emperor. She spoke to everyone else. People of the Dominion, she said, and her voice was carried on every frequency, in every language, to every ear on every world that remained. I have something to show you. She played the recording of Protocol Ashfall, the Emperor's own voice, unmistakable and undeniable, giving the order to destroy 46 worlds and murder the billions of people living on them. She played it from beginning to end, without commentary, without editing, without interruption. She let the Emperor's own words do what no human weapon ever needed to. When the recording finished, she spoke again. Your Emperor ordered the destruction of your worlds because he could not bear to lose control of them. The people on those worlds are safe. We have moved them beyond his reach, and they will be returned when it is safe to do so. But I want you to understand what was done in your name today. I want you to hear what your ruler chose when he was given a choice between change and murder. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was softer, not with weakness, but with something the Valerian had no word for. It was the sound of someone who carried a great weight and chose to carry it anyway. We will not choose your next leader. That is your right, and it has always been your right, even when someone told you otherwise. We will not occupy your worlds, or govern your people, or tell you how to live. What we have done is remove the tools of oppression. The weapons that kept slave worlds in chains are gone. The systems that enforced obedience through pain are gone. What you build from here is yours to build. She looked into the camera one final time. We are your neighbors. We have always been your neighbors. We live just beyond the edge of the space you know, and we have been there for a very long time. We watched because we believe that every civilization deserves the chance to find its own way. We acted because some lines once crossed cannot be forgiven by silence. We will be watching still. Not as rulers, not as judges, as neighbors. And we hope, sincerely, that we will never need to have this conversation again. The transmission ended. The Carthage held its orbit for 1 hour, then began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it turned away from Orithane, and aimed itself toward the edge of the galaxy, toward the dead corridor, toward home. On the throne world, the streets filled, not with soldiers, not with an organized rebellion, but with people. Millions of ordinary Valarin, who had heard their emperor order the murder of billions, and who had finally, after 12,000 years of being told that obedience was the highest virtue, decided that they had been obedient long enough. They walked to the palace. The guards, who had heard the same recording, stepped aside. The doors, which had been sealed for centuries, opened, and the emperor, alone in his bunker with nothing left but his title and his fury, heard the sound of his own people coming for him. He was not killed. The humans had asked for accountability, not blood, and something about that request had sunk into the minds of the Valaran people deeper than they realized. Zaelthar was removed from his throne and placed in a cell, alive and healthy and utterly powerless, which was, for a being like him, far worse than death. In the dead corridor, the maze unwound itself. The folded space flattened. The scattered Dominion ships reappeared in their home systems, confused but unharmed. The frozen ship, with its crew still locked in a single moment of time, was gently released and allowed to drift back to port. Every soldier who had been lost was returned. Every ship that had been taken was given back. The humans had fought an entire war against the most powerful empire in the galaxy, and had not killed a single person. Admiral Sathari returned to Orithane to find a world she did not recognize. The Emperor was gone. The War Council was dissolved. Vassal species were communicating freely for the first time in centuries, arguing and debating and disagreeing in the beautiful, messy, complicated way that free people do. She found Fenrath in his old office at the Intelligence Building, now promoted to a position that actually mattered, compiling a complete dossier on humanity. She sat across from him and asked the question that had been eating at her since the day the Carthage first appeared. How long were they watching us? Fenrath looked at her. He was not the nervous young officer she had met on the flagship. Something had changed in him, the same thing that was changing in all of them. A slow and uncomfortable realization that the universe was much larger and much stranger than they had ever been willing to admit. From the very beginning, Admiral, he said, from before we even had a word for star. Sathari sat with that for a long time. Then she stood, walked to the window, and looked up at the sky. The dead corridor was out there somewhere, invisible and silent, full of a civilization that had watched the Valaran grow from animals into conquerors, and had never once reached out, never once interfered, until the day it became necessary. She tried to imagine what that kind of patience felt like, and found that she could not. Far away, the Carthage slid through the darkness between stars, heading home. On the bridge, Captain Okafor Singh sat in her chair and watched the galaxy shrink behind her on the rear display. It had been a long mission, the longest of her career, and she was tired in a way that sleep would not fix, tired in the way that people get when they have seen the worst of what intelligent beings can do to each other, and have chosen to respond not with violence, but with something harder and more exhausting than violence. Something that required you to look at cruelty and not become cruel. Something that had no name in any Valaran language, but that humans had been practicing imperfectly and stubbornly for their entire history. A small alert chimed on her console. One of the long-range observation satellites had flagged something. A border world, one of the first to be freed from the Dominion's grip. The satellite's camera showed a street in a small city, where former slaves were walking in the open air without chains for the first time. And there, at the edge of the frame, a Valaran child was standing on a rooftop, looking up at the sky. The child could not possibly see the Carthage. It was far too distant, far too dark, far too well hidden. But the child was waving anyway, one small hand raised toward the stars, as if it somehow knew that someone up there was looking back. Captain Okafor Singh watched the image for a long moment. Then, alone on the bridge of the most powerful warship ever built by human hands, she raised her hand and waved back. The Carthage vanished into the dark, and the galaxy, for the first time in 12,000 years, was quiet in a way that felt like peace.